Looking at the musculotendinous structures at the wrist, we will look at just the wrist flexors, starting with the flexor carpi radialis to the palmaris longus to the flexor carpi ulnaris. The resistance that we will give for these muscles to contract will be wrist flexion, and so she will try to perform wrist flexion. I will give my resistance in the middle of the palm of the hand as to try to not let the finger flexors contract. Going at just lateral to the midline of the palmar crease here, we will see a tendon pop up, and we will palpate that particular structure. The osseous landmark, of course, will be the radial styloid process coming anterior. So don't let me move you, and I can palpate that flexor carpi radialis tendon. The next one will be wrist flexion, but she will approximate the thumb and the pinky or little finger as I resist flexion. Now, as you can see, this is still the flexor carpi radialis tendon. She does not have a palmaris longus tendon. If they did, it would stand out very prominently, and it'd be a very small pinstripe of a tendon there that we could palpate, and we would palpate that higher up in the mid-thenar, hypothenar eminence. I do not have one on either side. She does not have one on either side. So we cannot demonstrate this one, but I will demonstrate it in class. And you also have a picture in your syllabus. Moving to the pisiform as our bony landmark for the flexor carpi ulnaris, I will resist. Just relax your forearm and just flex your wrist. And I will use the pisiform as my bony landmark, and I will palpate the flexor carpi ulnaris, just proximal to the pisiform. The next one we are going to do is the flexor digitorum superficialis, profundus, and flexor pollicis longus. These are not so much palpatory as they are resistance to flex the flexor digitorum superficialis. We will give our resistance at the proximal phalanges. So she is trying to do this. And we can palpate the superficial tendons here, but we know that that is the superficialis because they do not flex the distal interphalangeal joint, or the DIP joints. For the profundus, we will want her to actually do this action. So you can actually have her put her hands directly on those because her fingers will match up at the creases, and you will just add a little bit of resistance and have her flex her DIP joints. And then you can add a little resistance to make sure that they are functioning well. For the flexor pollicis longus, we will want her to flex her DIP just like this, flex in that direction, and I give my resistance like this. I can actually feel this tendon at the proximal phalange. Moving to the other side of the wrist and hand, I am going to start from the radial side, moving to the ulnar side. I will start with the extensor carpi radialis longus, and with that, it is easiest to palpate with wrist extension and or radial deviation. So if I have her lift up in this direction, I am going to resist that motion, and my obvious bony landmark will be the base of the second metacarpal. Once I find the base of the second metacarpal, I will come off of that, and from that point I will be feeling a tendon pop into my palpation finger as I resist wrist flexion. Resist wrist extension. Don't let me move you. And there's a big tendon that pops right up there, and that is my extensor carpi radialis longus. The extensor carpi radialis brevis should be just to the ulnar side of that tendon. It actually goes to the third with a shoot or offspring off to the second metacarpal. So my bony landmark will be the base of the third. I will palpate down to the base of the third, come off into the joint space, and have her do the same action. Do not let me move you. Now this one is not as prominent, and it is flatter, so it is harder to palpate, but it is there. The next one will be your Extensor Carpi Ulnaris. This one I think is easiest to palpate with ulnar deviation and or wrist extension. So my bony landmark will be the head of the ulna. And the head of the ulna, I'm going to go just distal to that, and I'm going to resist ulnar deviation, and I just simply do not let me move you, and I can palpate that Extensor Carpi Ulnaris tendon right there. With the extensor indices and extensor digiti minimi, we will be using the finger extension, and the first one we will be doing is simply and then see where does extensor indices and extensor digiti minimi land or fall in relationship to You can actually on her see all of the tendons of Just know that extensor indices falls on the ulnar side as well as extensor digiti minimi. So you can actually see on her extensor digiti minimi, and if you move your finger back and forth, you can actually see two tendons run along there for extensor indices. So when we're palpating, all you do is palpate both tendons, knowing that the lateral one is the medial one is extensor indices. And then on the little finger, and on the ulnar side, extensor digiti minimi. The last ones at the wrist will be the ones that connect to the thumb and form our anatomical snuff box. The first one will be formed in pronated position, where we are going to extend the thumb. So extending the thumb, let's actually switch hands. Extend the thumb, and you can actually see on her the extensor pollicis longus. Now, you're not going to be able to see this on all patients, so we want to be able to palpate it, and we're going to palpate it across the carpal bones and resist thumb extension. Now remember, thumb extension is straight out like that. Thumb extension is like that. So they extend, we give resistance, and we palpate the extensor pollicis longus. For the extensor pollicis brevis, we are going to have them in the mid-pronated and supinated position, and they will extend the thumb. The resistance will be from the proximal or first phalange, and the proximal phalange, and I will resist extension there, and my obvious bony landmark will be the styloid process of the radius. Now you're going to be actually two tendons real close that are going to want to act together. So you're going to know that the more dorsal tendon is your extensor pollicis brevis, hence the brevis sandwich, the brevis being in the middle of the two longus. So there's her extensor pollicis brevis. So landmark is the radial styloid, resistance is at the proximal phalange, and we palpate the more dorsal tendon being the extensor pollicis brevis. For the abductor pollicis longus, the motion is going to be abduction of the thumb. So remember, this is abduction of the thumb in this plane. So she's going to be trying to do this. My resistance will be at the first metacarpal. My obvious bony landmark will still be the radial styloid process, but now on the volar or palmar surface of the wrist. So I'm going to have you go in this motion, and I'm going to give my resistance here, and then I'm still going to feel two tendons a lot of times because the extensor wants to help, but the tendon that is more on the volar side and more towards the medial of the two tendons is going to be your abductor pollicis longus.